Good GM Weed Gang people. I'm here today with a very special guest, my friend Hari, who is a fellow with deep passion for the cannabis plant. He's worked on it since 1995, a long contributor to a changing and undulating space. And he is the mastermind, the nurturing grower behind Sour Diesel, one of the most famous strains in the world, certainly imbibed by many millions of fine patrons. And I'm super stoked to be talking with you today, Hari. It's nice to meet you. How are you doing?
Great, Dan. How are you doing today?
I'm doing really well, and I'm stoked to be here with you and stoked to be able to share this with the Weed Gang audience. They know they're voracious for new knowledge, and no better than you to put it out there. And thanks for having us into your home today. I wanted to start really basic. Tell me about the age and stage you were at when you fell in love with cannabis.
Probably around when I was like 15 or so. I remember my one friend, Age, and his sister. We were out in the woods, and his sister was older than us, and she'd already been going to Dead concerts and Grateful Dead concerts, and that sort of like counterculture sort of vibe. And I remember we didn't have a pipe, so someone like rolled up tinfoil with like a pencil to make like the stem, and then more to make like the can part, and then put it together, and we went out and smoked some in the woods. And I remember not getting high at all, and my friend's sister just consistently being like, "You guys are so baked," and like, she had all this lingo and all these words that you could use about it and different things. And then it just sort of like fell in from there. I loved science fiction movies and a lot of comedy stuff. So we always saw like Cheech and Chong movies. With comics, I had like the Furry Freak Brothers and Dr. Atomic that talked a lot about cannabis smoking and sort of in this funny way. And then it just like progressed on from there, as a kid. And we'd have really bad quality stuff as a kid. And then it slowly, we watched this evolution of cannabis quality increase throughout the years.
I say to so many people these days, like, you guys don't know how good you got it. I'm a little younger than you, but when I was, smoking my first cannabis, you had no idea where it came from. You had no idea who grew it. Sometimes it'd be half decent, other times it wouldn't. But now everyone just hustled each other. You're a resident of the Pacific Northwest, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, me too. And this region of the world has, deep culture and breeding from a bunch of different angles. I'm British Columbia and you're Washington. But like, yeah, it's pretty wild. What do you think are the most notable differences in quality that you saw as you kind of got older and came up in the game? Like, what made the weed more exciting to you?
Cannabis, I think just the more of the acceptation, it being accepted as something people would want to have a part of their lives, and like using it in a medicinal sense and finding relief with it than having to use other substances that are available in our society. Seeing like this plant get this embracing sort of like hug from so many different people now, not just deadheads or hippies or who people like sort of attributed to, in our culture. I think that's really inspiring. That's been a big part of it.
It's so true. And it seems as though in our generation and younger, people are finding different ways to have relationships with cannabis or cannabinoids or different preparations. And that diversification, it's kind of like opening the doors to new social treatment too.
Yeah.
And it's when it's in your house and you're an MP, or when it's in your house and you're a politician of some kind, it's sort of hard to put up the fence that it's something evil.
Right. And then also too, with a lot of the deregulations, decriminalizations, there's a lot more studying that seems to be going on. So we're finding things like CBG and other parts of the cannabinoid and other cannabinoids that are aiding and helping us in different ways than just THC.
So interesting. So let's fast forward a little bit to the mid 90s. You get to start working with the plant. How did that come about? And take me on the journey that it went to breed Sour Diesel.
Well, I don't know. I guess one of my favorite quotes from Bob Snodgrass was purpose is discovered by accident, and it's sort of like what happened with us in a sense. We grew a little bit of cannabis to be in control of the quality of it and to set our own standards because of how much we didn't like some of the product we had to deal with eventually as we got older. And also it was just becoming a, sort of a thing to do and a lot of fun. So friends of mine had, originally we'd started out with a Purple Kush strain, and we were doing really well with that and growing. That was performing really well. We grew a lot of things from Amsterdam at the time that you could get from seed banks, and didn't end up keeping any of them because they didn't really perform the way that we were looking for. They didn't have those standards that we were looking for. And so it wasn't until we really kept genetics that we really liked around and started discovering more about propagation or growing seeds. It was more once we started learning more about Rob Clark and George Cervantes or Jorge Cervantes. They were giving out a lot of information in their books about breeding and things like that. So when that sort of started coming about, things really started getting really interesting.
That is compelling. And for those guys that haven't read those books, they are definitely ones to check out if you want to be dipping your toes in cannabis cultivation even a little bit. You talked about standards and you talked about product that you received that you didn't really love. It's no secret that in the mid 90s in British Columbia, widespread use of pesticides or chemical remediation was prolific. And there were definitely an incredible subset of growers that went the hard way and made sure that they were creating product that they could stand behind ingesting. I'm interested in those standards for you, and I'm interested in what motivated them. Like, what were you seeing in the market that you didn't appreciate?
Oh, just shitty Mexican weed or stuff like that. There wasn't even really a big indoor, sort of thing at that time. I mean, there probably was to a degree, and maybe I was just too young at the time to really see it all. But from what I understood, I mean, we were all just sort of guerrilla growers, just sort of doing it the best at however we could do it. There weren't big, huge grows except for in Northern California, I remember at the time. So we never used any sort of conventional standards to grow anything. We never used pesticides or anything like that to spray or chemicals to grow with. We just used organic materials,
Well, that's a huge, that I think is the underpinnings to any of the legendary people that we were talking to in this dialogue, which is so cool. But cultivating organically, and then the transition to hydroponics, which is a technology that most of us, wouldn't even really know too much about. But it was that time in the mid 90s is when it got really exciting, right?
That changed the game. Yeah, that was a big one. And when a lot of people adapted to hydroponics, you saw a big difference in the plant's performance and everything. And a lot of those influences came from Amsterdam and people going in the early 90s and seeing a lot of those setups. They also had aeroponics too, but it was still pretty experimental at the time.
little more sensitive of a system, and hydroponics proliferated. And I think we're congruent with this excitement around genetics. Once everyone could cultivate in hyper controlled environments, then the beans really started to matter. They really started to change, the output of what you could get, from yields to potencies to just beautiful exotic botany. And that's the world that you play in, that you played in to create Sour Diesel. How did Sour Diesel come about?
Well, friends of mine, we at the time were going to a lot of concerts, and we were just young kids. It was sort of like in our culture, and we were also going to the wetlands down in New York City, and there was always this stinky, really great cannabis that we would get, and it was called the Chem Dog, and then eventually that got sort of like renamed the Diesel, like New York City Diesel. So there was sort of like this confliction between, well, there has been now, of like Chem Dog and New York City Diesel, but it was sort of the same thing. Maybe New York City Diesel was a different phenotype than Chem Dog, or vice versa. I'm not sure. But regardless, friends of mine really liked that cannabis. When they could get it, they would save beans of it. There would be some beans, very few, but when they found them, they kept them, and eventually grew some things out and had a plant called Diesel Number 2, which was basically the original headband. And it was phenomenal. I mean, it's some of the best cannabis I've ever smoked. You could smoke, the hash from it, because we knew people from Amsterdam, that we started learning hash making techniques from Mila at Trichrome Technologies, and you would make this water hash from this Diesel Number 2, and literally would just lay you out. Like, it was phenomenal. They eventually that eventually got pollinated by an unknown male in a room, and the seeds that were from that, some were given to me, and it was called Our Chem. One time I was just hanging out, like just spacing out, and wrote like an S over, next to the hour, and just called Sour Chem, because at the time I really loved like Sour Patch candies, and sweet and sour soup at Thai restaurants and different places. It was sort of just in our palate, and it was just sort of this funny organic thing that we just did, and months and months later grew out the seeds, and there was only 5 of them, and then there was one in the 5 that was exactly what we were looking for. It looked like nothing I'd ever seen before. It looked and smelled a lot like other cannabis we had seen from the wetlands. So it made a lot of sense. It was just something we were sort of waiting to identify. And any of us could have found it. It was just sort of just happened to be me. And then I had to save the plant and regenerate it to get clones off of it. So that was this whole other gamble to see if it would stay alive. So we only harvested like a certain amount of it. And then because you needed to leave a certain amount for it to regenerate, I had been told to believe. And about a month or 2 later, it started shooting back out, little shoots in veg, and we were able to start cloning it. And the rest is history and stuff.
That is so cool. And like, how you talked about palate, like the familiarity of the taste of the cannabis from New York, the taste that you were having in your locality. Like, that's what I think a lot of people are discovering more and more as they see botanic diversity in cannabis, is that like it's kind of suits to their palate at a given time. There are very floral strains, very citrusy strains, very almost footsy, like nasty smelling strains. But those diesels and gas lines, I mean, you've seen a resurgence in it recently for sure. A lot of genetics being built off of beautiful, gassy, fuely kind of experiences. And it's just so cool. You guys were kind of 20 years ahead of the curve looking for that profile.
Well, the guys before us, like Chemdog Glass and Chemdog, like he really had it. Like they figured it out. They knew they had something special, and we were just trying to either, like imitate that and just have something similar, in our lives, because they were great inspiration, and it was amazingly done every time. Um,
So
so
you mentioned glass. You gotta in the crypto world of Web3, you gotta shamelessly shill. That's what they say for marketing. Your day job. Let's talk about glass. What's the good word about glass, man? Tell me first of
well,
all, why is good glass important to a serious cannabis smoker? Let's start there.
well, those standards were set by the man I just talked about earlier, by Bob Snodgrass. So in the 90s, maybe the late 80s, early 90s, he started selling glass pipes on Dead Tour. And I'm not sure, I'm not an expert on exactly when he started. I'm just saying. That's when I was introduced to him anyways, is when I would go to shows and you would go to the bus and him and his family would be there, and you'd be able to buy these pieces from this amazing gentleman, first and foreign, right even before the show, afterwards, whatever. And a lot of him and his students' philosophy was, you wanted a nice, comfortable piece that you could live with and use all the time, like a daily driver, a daily piece. And glass the ones that he was making, just fit so well. I mean, he had just come up with such a beautiful product. And I was so inspired by it that it just sort of stuck with me through the years. And I was in New Orleans in 2000 at it was New Year's, and we were at someone's house, and this woman lived in the Garden District. So she had this beautiful Victorian house, crushed velvet on the walls. And I mean, it was just amazing artwork, all this crazy stuff in there. And she's like, this is the best thing in my house. And she slammed down this light bulb, or this lamp, and then screwed in the light bulb into the lamp. And in the light bulb was a perfect bouquet of flowers that just lit up. And it was like this light bulb going off my head of wow, I wonder how I could get into making glass art. There's something about this. I saw it as a kid when I went to Corning Museum when I lived in upstate New York. And it just sort of all started falling into place and things like that. So it took a long time, long journey it's been. And I ended up studying with a lot of amazing people since my journey started with glass, American and Italian, and they all love cannabis. It's great.
Glass people and cannabis people together in the pursuit of the perfect glass blown pipe bong cannabis consumption artifact, which to our audience members, Hari is also a renowned creator of. And so Sour Silicates, the name of the brand, is that right, Hari? And people can find you on the internet.
Sour Silicate, you can find me out there. I make sets. I make all sorts of different pieces. Doing some ornaments right now for the holidays. I'm working for a great distributor right now, Puff Pendy Melt, where she puts a treasure or a piece in her candles, and you just melt them down and you find something. She represents hundreds of us artists helping us out. So it's a really good time. It's a good community.
Well, when the NFT world finds out about the power that they could bring to glass, I'm sure they're going to have a bunch of ideas.
Yeah, there's a lot of us. It was a great community to fall into, because a lot of, like I said, a lot of artists appreciate cannabis, and it was a good one. I'm really glad.
So I think it's fair to say that the road that cannabis is on today has been smoothed by a lot of sacrifice, a lot of pain in some cases, and a lot of suffering, incarceration, people fighting over their assets. I think it's important to touch on, some of the lessons that were learned as Sour Diesel became a worldwide phenomenon and obviously became, hugely valuable. I'd love to talk a bit about the pitfalls that you experienced and in reflection of why cannabis consumers and cannabis fans today are so lucky to live in a place without this kind of conflict.
Hmm. Uh, I don't know. I think the conflict continues to some degree. Um, and I think that some of it is just a human condition. You know, I don't think that a lot of stuff is personal either. I think that you create a vacuum and all sorts of stuff can happen, you know, and we weren't taught to be loud people and just yelling and, you know, saying who's number one and all this stuff. A lot of what happened was through a team of people. So it was always a team effort. So I didn't, you know, there's never sort of a sole, you know, person trying to reap all the prestige, you know. It was just sort of like, yeah, just a bunch of kids trying to have some fun. And unfortunately, the world is a dark and crazy place, and it'll take any of us and twist us around and you know, make things not good. So,
I really appreciate you sharing that. And I think it's a lesson that this new Web3 world has to hear. We have this new ability to create smart contracts that really are transparent and visible and determined at the outset and indelible and impermeable. And I think as I talk to more and more NFT people, Web3 people, they sound a lot like cannabis people in their idealism around a fair and structured set of parameters where who, you know, gets attributed things earns those attributions. And so that's why I'm so stoked that people like you are on this team, man, because we are going to put equity of these offerings into your hands. We're going to validate and we're going to really like promote the kind of passion that you've infused into your life into this community. That's what I want for this. And that's what I want for you guys watching. So Hari, with that, thank you so much for your time. And it's been a real pleasure getting to know you. I'm excited for our community to get to know you. And we're going to be on an adventure together for a while, man. So Sour Diesel reps up. If you can ever get your hands on that shit, you're so lucky. That's the truth.
Sour Strong.
All
Yeah,
right.
look up the Sour Legacy. You never know. Hey.